We're now going to be taking a closer look at a series of lectures on experimental design. The goals here will be to identify and define certain key terms, have a better understanding of why randomization is important to actually make inferences from experiments, to be able to identify some of the most common threats to inference, and to identify and describe differences between lab, field, and natural experiments, and also between experimental and observational research designs. So in a class of lab experiment, subjects are assigned to a group by, take a minute and think. So in a class of lab experiment, subjects are usually designed by random assignment. There are times whenever we might have self-selection based on demographics, but really random assignment is the foundation of a classic experimental design. So the trick here is that, in essence, you're supposed to have something like these two basically identical plants where one gets the treatment and the control group doesn't get the treatment. And again, which plants have to be randomly assigned. However, there is another very important key to this basic experimental setup. And that is that, in essence, the reason random assignment is so important is because you need the same types of subjects in the case of social science or whatever the thing is being experimented on, in some other cases, in this case the plants. So you don't want to have an experiment where you have a tomato plant versus a house plant, because then you don't know whether it's the fact that it's a difference in plants or the fact that it's a difference in treatments. So the idea of random assignment is once you have a subject pool, in essence, you're acting as if these two separate groups are essentially similar in all meaningful ways. So you've controlled for any differences like gender, demographics, just individual variation should be controlled by randomly assigning people to treatment. So the three basic types of experimental designs that we're looking at then are lab experiments, field experiments, and quasi-natural experiments. Let's talk a bit first about what it means to do an experiment in the lab. Basically, we can summarize them by these are experiments that are done under very tightly controlled conditions. So you actually go into a setting that is controlled by the researcher, and there's a lot of control over potential confounds, right? There's a lot of things that can be eliminated, both in the experimental design itself and in terms of random assignment. And that means that we have a high degree of internal validity. We're fairly sure that the treatment or the manipulation, the thing that we're changing, giving to one group of subjects and not another, is in fact the reason that if we see differences in the behavior of these two groups of subjects, we believe that it is the experiment that caused it, and therefore we say there's a high degree of internal validity. Additionally, it's fairly easy to have replicate. So there's been a lot of work done, particularly in the case of classic experiments, to replicate the findings. Interestingly, they don't all turn out the same way, but that's a discussion for more discussion for another day. So again, just to sort of summarize here then, lots of special environment where variables can be carefully controlled. Participants are aware that they're taking part in an experiment. Now, I would say that particularly in social psychology, often that people are aware, but they don't necessarily know the true goals of the experiment. There are cases in which some degree of deception, as long as there is a debriefing that follows it, are acceptable. But this is something where the actual norms on this can vary a little bit in terms of research ethics. But in general, we believe that, say, if you say you're going to have, we're bringing you for experimental political attitudes, and what you're really interested in was the effect of, say, implicit racial attitudes on political attitudes, you might have to debrief a bit more. You might not want to tell people that you were originally interested in their racial attitudes, but you can put that in a debrief would be one way to handle this issue. And again, the real point is that this is very carefully designed treatments and usually involving control groups. So just to give you an example here of the type of experiment we might be talking about, this is a Gartner and DeVideo experiment where there were basically portfolios of potential people to hire. And the different people that were being looked at in terms of their qualifications, so there were three types of applicants, either those with very strong credentials, moderate, or very weak credentials, and the only difference here is whether or not names were changed. So some of the names were ethnically white-sounding names, and others were ethnically black-sounding names. And what they found here is that, in essence, as you can see, when the credentials are strong or when the credentials are weak, there isn't a huge difference based on how likely the subjects were to recommend hiring a person with strong or weak credentials based on race. However, at the moderate credential area, we had a very strong pro-white bias. Interestingly, at the other two categories, if anything, there was a slight pro-black. I can't remember actually the size of the standard error to tell you for sure. An issue will be coming through later in the term when we talk about statistics. But this gives you an example. And this type of experimental design, by the way, is called a 3x2. There are, in essence, 3 treatment conditions along one axis, that's the level of credential, weak, moderate, or strong, and 2 along the others, that is whether there is a white name or a black name. So in essence, there are 6 total manipulations that get presented to the different subjects. So here is one that was part of this week's experimental survey that you might have taken, and that is Lisa Davis versus Mark Davis. So in essence, here we had a setup where people were asked about, they were given an email series that either involved Lisa Davis or Mark Davis, and then at the end, he ended up either presenting or not presenting. So what you can see here is that in essence, Lisa Davis was penalized quite a bit in terms of the salary increase and to a lesser extent the promotion when she didn't present compared to Mark Davis. And this is a pretty typical gender manipulation finding in that in general, again, you see this, it's sort of okay if they're both presenting, then no one is going to sort of complain, and it might even give Lisa in some case a bit of an edge, as we see in the promotion case. But whenever, in some ways, there is a justification available for not giving her the increase in the promotion, she gets dinged much more than Mark Davis would. So this again is a very interesting little treatment where people were given treatments. So the manipulation is that the subjects are basically told exactly the same thing. Researchers have found that people with high self-confidence are more susceptible to flattery than people with low self-confidence. Why do you think this is true? And then people write whether or not they found this statement surprising. And in essence, a lot of people end up finding that it's not that surprising once they have thought about. So in essence, you can justify something in hindsight. So even though the statements of both groups, in one case they're talking about high and the other are talking about low and who's susceptible to flattery, both people end up thinking that it's very reasonable in hindsight, even though the actual results are at odds. This is a very simple, what's called between subjects experiment, because half of the group got one treatment and half of the group got another. Whereas if we went back, by the way, to this particular setup, this is a 2x2 because you either got Lisa or Mark Davis, and then there was either a presentation or not a presentation at the end of it. So still between subjects because people only saw one of the 4 conditions, but the actual statement, instead of just a sort of typical 2 group, you've actually got 4 groups, 2 treatments along one axis and 2 on the other. Another experiment that we looked at here was where people were randomly assigned, again, it was a very simple between subjects experiment, to being either a manager or an employee. And then we're asked whether or not you believe that certain things like taking office supplies, calling in sick when it was just a personal day, making personal calls at the office, etc., were reasonable or ethical. And what you can see here is that the role that you're assigned to, whether you're assigned to be a manager or you're assigned to be an employee, has a pretty big impact on whether or not you think certain things are reasonable or not. And in fact, I've even found bigger effects than this in the past. But what is important to note here is this is a great example of people who start off essentially, there's random assignment, you know, it's not like there are the people who have been managers before. You aren't different to begin with. It's simply asking you to visualize yourself in that position is a treatment that then corresponds into different patterns of answering questions. Another classic experiment that we looked at here is Kahneman Tversky framing or question wording. Question, it's very well known. So if program A is adopted, either 400 people will die or 200 people will be saved. And so then you basically have program B being the exact same thing with this 1/3 and 2/3 probability. And the trick is basically if you ask people whether they want to, 400, if 400 people will die, then you see everyone wants to choose, this seems like it's backwards somehow. So in essence, whenever people will be saved, people overwhelmingly choose the save option. And if it's 400 people will die, people overwhelmingly choose program B. Another example that was on the survey here is basically an admiration ranking, and this is what's called a priming or queuing experiment, because what would happen is that we would ask, there was a list of companies in the response options, and so you would either see Deutsche Telekom, HSBC, or major corporations as the first option, and then you would be basically asked, what do you think of Deutsche Telekom, HSBC, or Company X, which is some third company, not either of those two. And what we can see is whether or not you're asked first about major corporations, Deutsche Telekom or HSBC, actually affects your rating for an unrelated Company X. And those things don't necessarily, right, if you compare that to the average rating among the control group, what we can see is that there's no such effect, really, among the control group on the ratings of Deutsche Telekom, HSBC, and major corporations. So just to review here then, thinking back, if you have candidate files varied by qualification, we can use a strong, and race, white or black. This is an example of, take a chance, as we remember before, this is a 3x2 design, right? Because there are 3 qualifications along the first axis and 2 along the second. If we were going to criticize Gartner and DeVideo, this original study that was had people, undergraduates, come in the lab and rate files, we might criticize it for lacking what type of validity. So again, lab experiments are most likely to lack external validity or generalizability. That it might be that if we even had the same type of experiment, but we sent it out to real people hiring real employees, or what's commonly called an audit study, that is a type of field study that actually might have quite a bit more validity than just simply plopping the same sets of qualifications down among 18 to 20-year-olds in a university setting. All right, so there are other types of experiments that we can run into. Some of them are quite interesting, in fact. So our manipulations we've looked at so far have been primarily text to some extent. But here's an example of the what's called the ergonomics of dishonesty, and you can link to the library through the link, that in essence, if you sit at a big desk, it makes people more likely to cheat. So the first manipulation that was used was an expansive pose versus a contracted pose. So in essence, subjects were asked to participate in a study. They were then told to either stand all sort of balled up or stand more expanded. And interestingly, though, they were asked to, there was basically a filler. They were asked a series of questions that was the purported goal of the study. This is actually one in which minor deception was used. But what was actually what they wanted to see was they then, in some cases, overpaid subjects by $5. And so what they wanted to see, right, if subjects would notice the extra $5 and then give it back. And so what they found was that people standing in the more expansive pose were much more likely to be dishonest and not return the money than those in the contracted pose. So you can see that it was 78% keeping the $5 versus 38%. Another example that was from the same study, so this is a classic psychological study where we're going to actually have 3 small experiments that test the same mechanism, which is how expansive your pose is, like the power pose feeling from yoga. And so in one case, they were sitting at a desk where they were quite spread out. In another case, they were quite contracted in, as you can see with the smaller desk. And so again, what you see is, I believe that here it was, they were asked to turn in how many words they had counted at given time, and so they lied about it. People who were standing at the expansive desk lied and said they generated more words or they made fewer mistakes than they actually did. There was a way they could keep track with hidden cameras. This, again, a third study where now they're playing a video game where they're supposed to avoid pedestrians. It's like one of those classics or car video games. And you can see that they're actually showing how expanded or contracted. So you can imagine this like sitting in an SUV versus sitting in a small like Prius, right? And what they find is that people in the expansive pose were basically more likely to knock things down. They ran into people. They were quite rude drivers in this game as compared to the people sitting in the contracted pose. Oh yeah, there's a number of collisions and hit and runs. It's a big, big difference. So in every case, what you've got is some treatment that's a between subjects treatment where people are assigned to either the expansive or contractive pose, 3 very different settings: keeping money, collisions and hit and runs in a game, or I think cheating on some sort of a word finding game. So this is telling us that this is a consistent mechanism that seems to be working across a range of conditions. Now, the problem, of course, as we know, is that there's limited internal validity, limited generalizability or external validity in lab settings. So there actually was a 4th study in this. But before going into that, what I want to talk about very much is the first thing they did to demonstrate the mechanism was they looked for a mediation. This is called a mediation analysis, mediation being a concept we talked about before, where they decided that what it gave you was a sense of power. So it should be that, in essence, most of the impact of posture, the effect of posture on hit and run, should be mediated by the sense of power. And without explaining exactly how that translates, what I can tell you is this is exactly what was found. So in all 3 cases, they were able to show that the mediation effect was being carried by sense of power from the posture, and that was what was leading. In this case, to the hit and run, but they were actually able to show it, I think, for at least one of the other studies. Finally, one of my favorites was that they then actually went out into the streets and they started counting tickets on cars. They basically looked who was willing to basically flout the laws and park in, and this is the Duchess's sister here getting a ticket, real life picture. But the real point is that the cars, they were much more likely to be large and expensive cars that were parked illegally. So sort of cheaper, more cramped cars like your little Prius were not as likely to park illegally when walking around the streets of London. Actually was where this study was done. So just a quick review here. So if we were going to classify subjects choosing to return an overpayment, would we think of this as, in essence, you can choose 2 options here. So take a second. So one of the first things you might have noticed is that it's clearly a measure, right? So there's this construct of in some way sort of cheating or violating a norm, but returning an overpayment, lying about the number of tests, number of hit and runs. Those are all measuring some construct, which might be something like violation or cheating. So it's clearly a measure. But in addition, it's worth noting that it's also behavioral measures. So they aren't saying, would you be willing to cheat? But they're actually getting the people to cheat. That's why it was so important to keep the actual purpose of the study hidden and why all the subjects had to be debriefed thoroughly after the conclusion of the study. So subjects having to stand in a contracted pose would be an example of, thinking back here, what type of variable? If you're thinking nominal, that's correct, because it's a binary, in essence, or nominal variable. You either are in it or you are not. Though, again, what's nice about the sense of power is that becomes no longer binary, but actually becomes more of an interval or ratio variable, right? So the thing that mediates, this mechanism they try to measure. So in each of the lab experiments, subjects were assigned to one of 2 treatments. And what type of design is that called? If you answered between subjects, that is correct, right? Because it's only 2 treatments. There aren't 4 treatments as you might get in a 2x2, or 6 treatments as you might get in a 2x3, and 3x2 you get 12. But what you have here is some subjects, there are 2 treatments, 1 subject, people are randomly assigned to one of 2 groups, and it's